The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor at 11:47 p.m., and Maya Whitfield stood frozen in the private foyer of a penthouse she had never been invited to before, staring at security footage frozen on a wall-mounted screen, her own face from 6 years ago, in a building that had burned down before she'd ever worked a single day at this company. Behind her, a voice she recognized as her CEO said quietly, "I need you to tell me if that's really you in this photograph. Because if it is, we have a much bigger problem than either of us realized." Maya's hands went cold. She didn't know how to answer. If you've ever gotten a call from someone powerful that made absolutely no sense until it was far too late to walk away, stay with me. Because what happened in that penthouse that night had nothing to do with what Maya assumed when the invitation first arrived, and everything to do with a secret that had been waiting 6 years to find her. Maya Whitfield had worked at Holloway Dynamics for 2 years and 11 months, long enough to know the building's rhythms without ever once being noticed by the woman who ran it. She was 31, a mid-level data analyst on the risk assessment team, the kind of employee whose work quietly held up systems nobody upstairs ever thought to ask about. She showed up early, left late, kept her head down, and had built a life around a kind of careful invisibility that had nothing to do with lack of ambition, and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had, 7 years earlier, lost almost everything she owned in a fire that still occasionally visited her in dreams she didn't talk about with anyone. The fire had taken an apartment building on the east side of the city, 6 years and 4 months ago, in the middle of a February night so cold that firefighters' hoses had frozen mid-spray against the brick facade. Maya had lived on the 3rd floor. She had gotten out with a coat, her phone, and nothing else, standing on the sidewalk at 2 in the morning watching everything she owned turn to smoke, while a neighbor she barely knew wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and told her gently that she was one of the lucky ones. 3 people in that building had not been so lucky. Maya did not like to think about the fire. She had spent years building a life on the other side of it, quietly, carefully, the way people do when they've learned that some kinds of loss don't announce themselves in advance. She did not, in any version of her life before that Tuesday afternoon, expect Diane Castellan to know anything about it. Diane Castellan had built Holloway Dynamics from a 12-person consulting operation into a company with 400 employees and a headquarters that occupied the top 11 floors of one of the city's newest glass towers. She was 52, precise in every visible way. Her clothing, her schedule, the particular clipped efficiency with which she moved through the building's hallways surrounded by an orbit of assistants who never quite managed to keep pace with her. She was, by every account Maya had ever heard secondhand through the break-room grapevine, brilliant, demanding, and almost entirely unknowable outside the walls of quarterly earnings calls. Maya had spoken to her exactly twice in nearly 3 years of employment, both times in large meetings where Diane had asked a single sharp question and moved on before Maya had fully finished answering it. Which was why, when Maya's phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in October and her screen displayed an internal extension she didn't recognize, she assumed it was a wrong number, a misdialed call meant for someone else's desk. It was not a wrong number. It was Diane Castellan's executive assistant, a composed, careful woman named Priya who spoke with the particular gentleness of someone delivering news she herself did not fully understand, asking whether Maya would be available to meet with Ms. Castellan that evening privately at her residence rather than the office. Maya sat very still at her desk for a long moment after that call ended, running through every possible reason her CEO might want to see her alone, after hours, somewhere outside the building entirely, and finding none of them reassuring. She asked Priya carefully what the meeting was regarding. Priya's answer did nothing to settle the growing unease in Maya's chest. "I honestly don't know," Priya said. "She asked me to find you specifically. She had your personnel file open on her desk for almost an hour before she asked me to make the call." Maya spent the rest of that afternoon unable to concentrate on anything, running through the small, mundane catalog of possible workplace transgressions in her mind. A report she might have gotten wrong, an email she might have phrased poorly, some quiet mistake that had somehow found its way up 11 floors to the desk of a woman who had spoken to her exactly twice. None of it explained the specificity of it, the personnel file left open, the request for privacy, the location chosen deliberately outside the office. By the time she left work that evening, changing out of her cardigan into the one blazer she owned that felt appropriate for whatever this was, Her hands had developed a faint, persistent tremor she couldn't quite talk herself out of. The address Priya had sent her belonged to a residential tower 6 blocks from the office, the kind of building with a doorman who checked names against a list before allowing the elevator to even accept a floor selection. Maya gave her name at the desk, feeling, for a strange, disorienting moment, like she was walking into an interrogation rather than whatever this actually was. The elevator required a key card that the doorman inserted and removed himself before stepping back, and Maya rode up in silence, alone, watching the floor numbers climb past 40 before the doors finally opened directly into a private foyer that served, apparently, as the entrance to a single residence occupying the entire top floor. The doors slid open, and the first thing Maya noticed was not the apartment itself, though it was extraordinary in the understated way that only genuine wealth achieves. The second thing she noticed, the thing that made her stop entirely in the doorway with her heart suddenly hammering somewhere near her throat, was the enormous screen mounted on the far wall of the foyer, displaying what was unmistakably a security camera still frame. Grainy and time-stamped in the corner, with a date that made Maya's stomach drop through the floor the instant she registered it. February 14th, 6 years and 4 months ago, the night of the fire. And in the frame, unmistakably, despite the grain and the poor lighting, was her own face. "That's you," said a voice behind her, and Maya turned to find Diane Castellan standing a few feet away, not in the sharp business attire Maya had only ever seen her in at the office, but in a simple cardigan, her hair down, looking, for the first time since Maya had ever laid eyes on her, less like a CEO and more like a person who had not slept properly in some time. "Isn't it?" Maya's mouth had gone completely dry. "I don't understand," she managed. "Where did you get this?" "It's from a security system that was decommissioned when the building it monitored burned to the ground," Diane said, her voice carefully even in a way that Maya was beginning to recognize as effort rather than natural calm. "I need you to look at it very carefully, Maya, and tell me if that's really you. Because if it is, we have a much bigger problem than either of us realized." Maya stared at the frozen image on the screen, at the timestamp, at the version of herself standing frozen in a hallway she recognized instantly even 7 years later, and felt the careful architecture of her ordinary life begin, quietly and without warning, to come apart at the seams. "That's the building I lived in," Maya said slowly. "Before the fire, I don't understand why you have this. I don't understand why you're showing me this." Diane didn't answer right away. She walked past Maya into the main living space of the penthouse, gesturing for Maya to follow, and Maya found herself moving on legs that didn't entirely feel like her own, past floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city glittering coldly in the October dark, toward a low table where a folder sat waiting, thick with documents that Maya could see, even from a distance, were considerably older than anything a normal workplace conversation would ever require. "Sit down," Diane said, and it wasn't unkind, but it wasn't a request either. Maya sat. "7 years ago," Diane began, "my younger brother was living in that same building. His name was Ethan. He was 26 years old, and he was one of the 3 people who didn't make it out that night." She paused, and something in her carefully composed face cracked, just slightly, just enough for Maya to glimpse, for the first time, the person underneath the executive. "I have spent 7 years believing his death was an accident. Faulty wiring, a space heater left on too long, the kind of tragedy that happens and nobody is responsible for beyond bad luck. That's what the official report said. That's what I told myself for 7 years, because the alternative was unbearable." Maya felt something cold settle low in her chest, an instinct telling her that whatever came next in this conversation was going to be considerably worse than anything she had imagined on the drive over. "6 weeks ago," Diane continued, "I acquired a smaller company as part of an unrelated business deal. Standard due diligence, nothing unusual. Except buried in their archived records was a security contract from 7 years ago, the same company that had handled fire suppression system monitoring for the building where my brother died. And buried inside that contract was something that should never have existed. Documentation showing that the fire suppression system in that building had been flagged as non-functional 4 months before the fire, and that the property management company had chosen not to repair it because the projected cost exceeded what they were willing to spend before an upcoming sale of the property." Maya sat very still, the pieces beginning, slowly and sickeningly, to assemble themselves into a shape she didn't want to look at directly. "They knew," Diane said, her voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than Maya had ever heard from her. The people who owned that building knew the fire suppression system didn't work, and they let people keep living there anyway, because fixing it would have cost them money before they flipped the property. My brother didn't die because of bad luck. He died because somebody decided a repair bill mattered more than the people sleeping in that building. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Maya could hear the faint hum of the city through the windows, could hear her own pulse in her ears, could feel the specific, disorienting vertigo of having spent 7 years grieving her own losses from that night without ever once considering that someone else in that building had lost something far worse, and that the two of them, strangers until an hour ago, were now sitting in the same room bound together by a truth neither of them had asked to inherit. "I still don't understand why you called me," Maya said finally. "Why me specifically?" Diane reached for the folder on the table and opened it, sliding a single document across toward Maya. "Because when I started pulling every piece of documentation I could find related to that night, I found the tenant list, and I found your name, and then I found something else." She tapped the document. "You filed a complaint with the building management company 3 weeks before the fire. About the fire alarm in your unit going off falsely, and then, according to your complaint, not going off at all during a test the following week." Maya's breath caught. She remembered that complaint vaguely, the way you remember something you filed away as an irritation rather than a warning, back when she was 24 and mostly concerned with rent, and a job she didn't love yet, and a life that felt, in retrospect, unbearably ordinary in the specific way you only recognize ordinariness once it's been taken from you. "I remember filing it," she said slowly. "Nobody ever responded. I just assumed maintenance was slow, the way it always was in that building." "You were the only tenant who filed anything in writing," Diane said. "Everyone else who might have noticed something either didn't survive the fire, or didn't think to put it on paper, or simply moved on with their lives the way people do after something terrible happens, and there's no obvious place to direct the anger. You're the only documented evidence from before the fire that someone in that building knew something was wrong and tried to report it." Maya looked down at the complaint, her own handwriting, 7 years younger and considerably less careful, staring back up at her from a photocopy she hadn't known existed anymore. "You need me as a witness," she said slowly, understanding beginning to arrive in pieces. "That's what this is. You're building a case against the people who own that building, and you need someone who can testify that the danger was reported and ignored." "That's part of it," Diane admitted. "But it's not the reason I called you here tonight instead of having a lawyer reach out to you formally tomorrow morning." She paused, and for the first time since Maya had walked into the penthouse, Diane Castellan looked unmistakably uncertain. "I hired you 2 years and 11 months ago. Do you remember that interview?" Maya did remember it, though she hadn't thought about it in years. A single round of interviews, unusually brief for a company of Holloway's size, conducted not by the hearing manager she'd expected, but by Diane herself, who had asked a handful of pointed questions about Maya's analytical approach, and then, almost as an afterthought at the very end, had asked where Maya had lived before her current apartment. Maya hadn't thought anything of the question at the time. It had felt like small talk, the kind interviewers sometimes made to fill silence. "I pulled your resume because your qualifications were strong," Diane said, "but I recognized your previous address the moment I saw it. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't have the documentation. I didn't know about the fire suppression failure. I didn't know my brother's death was preventable. All I knew was that you had lived in the same building where he died, on the same floor, 3 doors down from his unit, and something in me needed to know who you were. I told myself it was curiosity. I hired you because your resume was genuinely excellent. But I would be lying if I said the address wasn't part of why I remembered your name specifically enough to bring you in myself, instead of letting HR handle it the normal way." Maya sat with that for a long moment, the strange, vertiginous realization settling over her that she had spent nearly 3 years working 2 floors below a woman who had, without ever telling her, been quietly carrying a version of the same night that haunted Maya's own dreams, connected to her by a coincidence of geography that neither of them had understood the weight of until 6 weeks ago. "Why didn't you say anything before now?" Maya asked. "If you knew, if you'd suspected something for 2 years." "Because for 2 years all I had was an address and a feeling," Diane said. "I didn't have proof. I wasn't going to walk up to an employee and say I think you might have information about my brother's death based on nothing but where you used to live. That would have been cruel and unfair to you, and frankly unprofessional in ways that could have created real problems for both of us. I needed something concrete before I could justify bringing this to you at all. 6 weeks ago, I got it. Maya looked back at the frozen security image still glowing on the foyer screen, visible from where she sat, her own face from 7 years ago staring back at her from a night she had spent years trying not to think about too closely. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. "Specifically, beyond the complaint." Diane's expression shifted, something in it going carefully deliberate. "I'm building a case quietly against the property management company and the ownership group behind that building. It's going to be expensive, and it's going to be slow, and there's a real chance it goes nowhere given how much time has passed and how much money is on the other side of this fight. I have the resources to pursue it regardless of the outcome, and I intend to, because I owe that much to Ethan even if it takes years, and even if it never results in anything a courtroom would call justice." She paused. "But I can't build it credibly without people who are actually there. Tenants who notice things. Tenants who can speak to what that building was actually like before the fire, beyond what's written in an insurance report designed to make the fire look unavoidable. I've been trying to locate former tenants for 6 weeks. Most of them have vanished into new lives, understandably wanting nothing to do with reliving that night. You're the first person I've found who still lives in this city, who I already had a professional relationship with, who filed something in writing before it happened." "You want me to testify?" Maya said. "Eventually, if it comes to that, yes. Tonight I want something smaller." Diane reached into the folder again and pulled out a single sheet, sliding it across the table. It was, Maya realized after a moment of studying it, a floor plan of the building, the third floor specifically, with individual units labeled. "I want to know what you remember. Not for a deposition, not for a lawyer, just for me. I've spent 7 years not letting myself ask anyone what that building was actually like before it happened, because asking meant admitting I needed to know, and needing to know felt like it would break something in me I wasn't ready to have broken. I'm asking you tonight because I don't think I can keep building this case without finally letting myself hear it from someone who was actually there." The two of them sat in that penthouse until nearly 2 in the morning, and what unfolded between them over those hours was not the meeting Maya had braced herself for on the drive over. Not a reprimand, not a strange proposition, not any of the anxious scenarios she'd cycled through sitting in traffic 6 blocks from her apartment. It was something quieter and considerably heavier. Two women who had never truly spoken to each other before that night, sitting across a low table in the specific hush of a city sleeping below them, piecing together the last fragments of a building that no longer existed, and a night that had shaped both their lives in ways neither of them had fully understood until a folder of old documents landed on Diane Castellan's desk 6 weeks earlier. Maya told her about the false alarms, about the maintenance requests that went unanswered for weeks at a time, about a neighbor on the 4th floor, a man named Gerald, who had complained loudly and often in the building's shared laundry room about smelling something like burning wire near the utility closet. Complaints that everyone had half listened to, and nobody had escalated because Gerald complained loudly and often about a great many things. And it was easy, in retrospect, to have dismissed a real warning simply because it arrived wrapped in the same tone as 100 smaller, less consequential grievances. Diane listened to all of it without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, and somewhere in the middle of Maya's account of the night itself, the smoke alarm that had, for once, actually worked, the frantic scramble down 3 flights of stairs already thick with smoke, the sidewalk afterward, and the specific, disorienting cold of standing in February air in nothing but a coat while everything she owned burned 4 stories above her. Diane's composure finally fully broke, and she cried in a way Maya suspected she had not allowed herself to cry in the 7 years since her brother's death. Not in front of employees, not in boardrooms, not anywhere the careful architecture of her professional life could witness it. "He called me 2 days before it happened," Diane said once she could speak again, her voice raw in a way that made her sound, for the first time all night, considerably younger than 52. "He said the smoke detector in his unit kept beeping like the battery was low, and he'd changed it twice and it kept happening anyway, and he was annoyed about it, the way you're annoyed about small inconveniences you assume will eventually just get fixed. I told him to call maintenance and hung up because I was busy that week, because there was always something more urgent than a beeping smoke detector, and 2 days later he was gone, and for 7 years I told myself there was nothing anyone could have done differently." Maya, who understood something about carrying an ordinary phone call as the last one, reached across the table without entirely deciding to and put her hand over Diane's, and neither of them said anything else about it, because some moments don't require narration, only presence. What happened in the weeks that followed was not the dramatic courtroom reckoning that this kind of story sometimes promises and rarely delivers. It was slower, more grinding, more true to how these things actually unfold in the real world. Diane's legal team formally opened an investigation into the property management company and the ownership group, building a case methodically around the fire suppression documentation, Maya's original complaint, and testimony gathered carefully from the handful of former tenants Diane's investigators eventually managed to locate across 3 different states. Maya gave a formal statement, then another, watching her own quiet, half-forgotten complaint from 7 years earlier become, slowly, one of the central pieces of evidence in a case that would take the better part of 2 years to fully resolve. The property management company settled eventually, out of court, for a sum that Diane never discussed publicly, and that Maya only learned about second-hand, months later, through a brief item in a business publication that most people scrolled past without a second thought. It was not the criminal reckoning Diane had privately hoped for in the early months of the investigation, when her grief still occasionally curdled into something closer to fury than justice. But it was, according to Diane herself, enough to force real, documented acknowledgement of what had happened, enough to fund a foundation Diane quietly established in Ethan's name, dedicated to fire safety advocacy and rental housing, that would go on in the years that followed to fund inspections and repairs in buildings whose tenants had no idea a stranger's grief had made their homes safer. Maya's role in the company changed, too, though not in the way she might have once imagined a story like this ending. Diane didn't promote her out of guilt or gratitude in some dramatic, sweeping gesture. That wasn't who she was, and Maya, if she was honest with herself, wouldn't have wanted it that way regardless. What changed instead was smaller and more durable. Diane began, occasionally, stopping by Maya's floor rather than always summoning people up to hers, asking real questions in meetings instead of the single sharp query and immediate departure Maya had grown accustomed to over 3 years of near invisibility. The distance between the 40th floor and the analyst desks 2 levels below the executive suite didn't disappear. Exactly, but it became, in small and specific ways, less absolute than it had been before that October night. A year later, Maya was invited to the opening of a small fire safety resource center in the old neighborhood where the building had once stood, funded quietly through the foundation Diane had established, standing now on the very lot where the fire had happened, transformed into something that would, going forward, protect people neither of them would ever meet. Diane gave brief, careful remarks to a small gathering of local residents and city officials, thanking no one by name, mentioning her brother only once, in a single sentence that carried the full weight of 7 years without needing to elaborate further. Afterward, standing together at the edge of the small crowd while volunteers handed out fire safety literature to families from the surrounding blocks, Diane turned to Maya and said something that Maya would carry with her for a long time afterward. "I called you to my penthouse that night because I needed a witness," Diane said. "I understand now that what I actually needed was somebody who understood what it costs to survive something and then have to keep living an ordinary life around the edges of it. I didn't know I needed that until you sat down across from me." Maya thought about the frozen image on that foyer screen, her own face from 7 years ago staring back at her under a timestamp she hadn't been ready to see, and understood, finally, why Diane hadn't simply sent a lawyer, hadn't simply handled this the efficient, distant way she handled almost everything else in her professional life. Some truths are too heavy to hand off to someone else to deliver on your behalf. Some truths you have to sit across a table from, at nearly midnight, in the company of the one other person who might actually understand the full weight of what you're finally allowing yourself to say out loud. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever carried a private grief that finally found the one other person who understood its full weight without needing an explanation, tell me in the comments what you think finally let Diane ask the question she'd been avoiding for 2 years. Share this with someone who's ever needed a witness to something too heavy to carry alone. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next video.